Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. Joining us this week from Washington, D.C. is Elise Labott, who is a columnist for foreign policy. Elise, welcome. Great to have you back. Also from Washington, Nirmal Ghosh, who is the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Straits Times in Singapore. Nirmal, great to see you again.
Thank you.
And from London, Gideon Rachman, who is the chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times. Gideon, great to have you as well. Let's start, Elise, with the biggest news of the week. Ceasefire has been announced, a quiet for quiet, in which neither side will hit each other again, as they have with extraordinary intensity over the past 10 days in Israel and Palestine. How did we get to this point of a ceasefire? Was it because both sides have basically achieved what they wanted to do? Was it pressure from the international community? Was it the quiet diplomacy of Biden? Was it all of the above? How do you think we got to the point? And frankly, why did it take more than 10 days to get to here?
Well, it did take 10 days, Ivo, but I will point out that this is still a much less time, much shorter period than some of the others. 2004 was a far longer period, 2014, excuse me. And I would attribute it really to all of the above. I mean, I think Israel made pretty clear that it wanted to degrade Hamas to a certain extent. Israeli officials tell me they weren't really looking and knew they couldn't defeat Hamas. They had a period of 7 years since 2014 of relative quiet since the last time they degraded them. So they wanted to go after those tunnels. They wanted to go after that arsenal. And they feel that they did that. I think Hamas thinks that it was able to claim some victory. When you had that shooting into the Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli police, when you had the evictions of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, really no leadership from Palestinian President Abbas. And so Hamas kind of stepped up and said, we're the ones that can, represent the Palestinians' frustrations. And they feel as if they did that. And then it was, as you said, diplomacy, mostly by Egypt, also by Qatar. And then there was that quiet diplomacy by President Biden. Didn't want to criticize the Israelis out loud. But I would say officials told me the administration was supportive, but their role was minimal. But clearly when the US president starts calling 6 times in the last few days and finally says, he said de-escalation on a path to a ceasefire, that really means get the job done, but do it quickly, right? So we have a ceasefire. It's held since 7 o'clock, Eastern time last night. Things seem to be quiet, but we have to see in 2014, there were a few of these quiet for quiet policies. And then the bigger challenges remain. What's going to happen with police at the Al-Aqsa Mosque? What's going to happen with these evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and the violence that's really spreading throughout the territories and mixed cities between Jews and Arabs? And then you have rehabilitation of Gaza, improving relations between Israel, Hamas, and Fatah. A lot really still a tinderbox in the area. So far, the ceasefire is holding.
So thanks, Elise. I think that makes makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of things are contributing. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of open questions, Nirmal. They have the question of what is the U.S. policy towards the region. There's the question of what is happening within the Palestinian community and whether they are able to unite under some leadership, or if the population, which is rallying today throughout the territories in great numbers, is fed up enough to move to a new stage of engagement. We have the question of the Arab leadership, that particularly those who signed on to the Abraham Accords, and whether they're willing to move forward. And of course, there's Israeli domestic politics, with Netanyahu looking to see if he can remain in power through a 5th election. What's kind of the big thing, Nirmal, that looking at where we are today, that you are focused on and think people may be forgetting or ought to be focused on for going forward?
I think what you just briefly mentioned, one new factor, of course, is the internal situation in Israel. And people were talking about even passions were so high, mobs roaming around attacking each other and so forth. That is something which is very, very serious. If all the state parties sort of descend into sort of disorder like this, that makes things just much more predictable. You can't have, and this has happened sporadically in other parts of the world with some of these demonstrations, right? And the ceasefire didn't come a moment too soon. Hopefully, it will hold. But I would say, yeah, the domestic situation in Israel, the sort of supercharged animosity between the two communities is a cause for real concern.
I think that's and it's nothing that has happened with the ceasefire that is going to change that. I think, Nirmal, exactly. Gideon, while you unmute, you wrote in your column this week that the violence showed that the Abraham Accords were based on a faulty premise, that somehow Netanyahu and the U.S. could ignore the Palestinian problem. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have a vote in this, and they came forward. Is that the big takeaway? That you have a more radicalized, is that the right word? More focused effort on the Palestinians to bring the issue back on the table, not only in Israel but for the region and globally?
Look, I don't know how focused it is or even how thought out it is, but I mean, I think that the assumption, or maybe just hope, on the Netanyahu side was that they'd found a new way of dealing with this, which was essentially that you don't have to deal with it, that you deal with Israel's problems externally, that if you can deprive the Palestinians of the support of the wider world, and particularly of the Arab world, they'll really have nowhere to go. Israel will then be able to impose a solution on the Palestinians, and problem, if not solved, dealt with. And of course, there's always the sense that Israel will come back to take a bit more in terms of the threat of annexation, the pressure of the far right in Israel to, for example, these evictions in East Jerusalem, which were part of what provoked this thing. But I think that to me, is a misreading of human nature, that if people are walled up in Gaza, if they see their homes being taken away, it just seems implausible that they're not going to respond in some way or another. And so, there are some Israelis as well, even on the left, who say, well, look, there are just peoples who get a raw deal from history. The Tibetans, for example, were cited and maybe the Palestinians just have nowhere to go and they're going to lose hope and the world will forget about them. But to me, the sort of analogy with the Tibetans doesn't quite work, because they don't have a huge sort of Muslim community behind them in the world. They're in a very remote geographical area. So it's kind of easy, and China's scarier than Israel, to be honest. It can ward off its critics. So I think that, although I wouldn't dispute that Israel has hugely improved its position internationally, I don't think that alone is going to solve the problem. And I think that's what we've seen this week.
So, Elise, what's the impact here on sort of in the United States on the domestic politics and sort of the policy of the Biden administration towards the region? Biden was able to basically do what U.S. administrations have done, is to show support for Israel while trying to calm the situation. But at the meantime, not only in the streets, but on Congress and in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, pressure is really building up for the U.S. to change policy. How do you see the Biden White House and State Department maneuvering both the desire not to get too much involved in this part of the world, and at the same time the pressure that's coming from the progressive wing of the party?
That's right. Well, look, you saw an extraordinary move yesterday by Senator Bernie Sanders to block the sale of arms to Israel, of these kind of precision munitions that sometimes are used to attack Israelis, and Sanders kind of really panning the US government for being too accommodating to Israel. And that's, I think there's been this movement on the left really to pay more attention to how the Israelis are treating the Palestinians. I think it's growing now. You see a lot more progressives that are growing louder on a whole lot of issues. taking this on. They tried to do it in 2016, but certainly now they are. And even Schumer, Charles Schumer, the majority leader, who's a staunch defender of Israel, had to sign on to a statement that he wanted a ceasefire. So clearly President Biden is feeling this pressure. He also made clear, and Blinken made clear even in his nomination here, confirmation hearing, that they don't see this as a priority. As we know, like in The Godfather, they say the Middle East has a way of, just when you think you're out, drawing you back in. The administration is forced to deal with it right now. Does Biden feel, just like Israel, that he could deal with a flare-up every few months? I think we'll have to see. I also think we're going to have to see how it plays out here in the United States. I don't think it's a very large majority of progressives. Clearly, the Republicans are very pro-Israel. I don't think it's a very large sector that is going to be fighting for this. So I think it's more symbolic, but it's going to force a discussion of the issue and here in the United States, and it's going to force it in the media. And I think that's important. I just want to quickly pick up on Gideon's point about the kind of Palestinians and the Abraham Accords. I completely agree that they miscalculated. I also think the US and Biden now has an opportunity to kind of seize the Abraham Accords, work with the Arabs and say, okay, President Trump might have done this for the wrong reasons, to bypass the Palestinians. Can we use this to be more creative? Can we use this to, now that Israel has a little bit better relations with some of these Arab states, to work with the Israeli government, to give them security while at the same time improving the lives for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? I think that's really going to be the key. Until you improve the situation for the Palestinians, you're not going to get the kind of political leadership you need from the Palestinians, and that's not going to be able to kind of create the conditions for negotiation. So my personal feeling is President Biden came into office saying, democracy is so important. The U.S. spreading democracy and supporting democracies around the world is one of the cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy. Well, neither Israel nor the Palestinians are acting all that democratic right now. So maybe strengthening those leaderships with the Arabs, the UAE is coming on the UN Security Council, working in that space, making those countries or populations more responsive to the people. I think that's going to create the conditions for a better situation. We can't go for a peace deal. No one's talking about that, but they can kind of change the balance of power on the ground, I think.
Elise rightly sort of looks at sort of the top-down politics of Nirmal, of what leaders can do in order to help manage the situation. In the meantime, as you point out, there's a bottom-up politics with, particularly in the Palestinian community, with widely supported outside of the Palestinian community around the world, with large demonstrations, really pressing for rights, for some movement and some improvement in lives. What's your sense of how that will play out in other countries around the world, whether they will insist on trying to improve the situation in Gaza, of course, on the West Bank, for the average Palestinians, and perhaps lead to some kind of process that settles this conflict? Do you see that happening?
Yes, to some degree. One of the problems is, of course, that this every new fresh cycle of conflict takes place in a much more supercharged and pervasive social media news feed environment. So everybody is much more aware of it, and it happens much faster than it happened, say, back even in 2014 or prior to that. I think a lot of people will be talking privately, but most governments, especially those far away from a policy level, for example, in Asia, they will focus on not trying to inflame the situation, because it is so. Everybody has blood on their hands. There is no shortage of injustice on all sides in the conflict, perpetrating injustice, being the victims of injustice. It is so emotional. And of course, the geopolitical aspect is there as well. So from a policy standpoint, I think if you look at, for example, let's say Southeast Asia, the governments would really just keep their heads down and focus on not saying anything. I mean, engaging pragmatically at multilateral forums, saying, look, you've got to do something about it. Everybody recognizes this. It's not new, right? Everybody recognizes that the situation of the Palestinians has to be improved. If otherwise, we're just stuck in this basically immutable conflict. So, you know, another round of fighting, they say the right things privately, try not to say the wrong things publicly, and hope that, you know, it settles down again, because a lot of these countries want to have a pragmatic relationship with Israel. India, for example. Interestingly, one other quick aspect is, you know, we have this sort of rise of the right wing everywhere, of course, and Israel, in India, the social media has been alive with support from the right wing for Israel. So this has resonance, a lot of resonance in a lot of places, which is why, you know, it is probably sensible for some of these countries to keep quiet about it and not take definitive public positions, and just do everything behind closed doors and in meetings with, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just jump in there. I mean, I think it's a very interesting aspect that Nirmal highlighted. I mean, I'm not at all surprised that the BJP piled in behind Israel, and I think there's a slightly paradoxical aspect to Israel's international profile now. The Israelis have traditionally presented themselves accurately as the only democracy in the Middle East, but some of their biggest supporters internationally are the sort of far-right populists who have a very equivocal relationship with democracy. Bizarrely, you know, in the European Union, Viktor Orban of Hungary, who domestically uses anti-Semitism against George Soros, is actually a big supporter of Netanyahu, because I think Hungary for the Hungarians, Israel for the Jews, quite similar pictures. They're forms of ethnic nationalism. You know, Bolsonaro, when he was inaugurated in Brazil, the two guests of honor were Netanyahu and Orban. And the way in which Israel has now become part of this argument about strongman leadership, ethnic nationalism around the world, is quite interesting, but it's helpful to Israel in some ways. It gives them a sort of batch of people who are kind of emotionally committed to them, but it also complicates the narrative in odd ways. And it's one of the reasons, I think, incidentally, that they're losing liberal support in the United States, because, you know, Trump also was part of this populist, nationalist, we identify with Israel, zero sympathy for their antagonists. And of course, you know, people who oppose Trump in the United States notice that. And to some extent, it must tarnish liberal support for Netanyahu.
Just super quick, I also think it makes it more dangerous. Look, a lot of this started when Netanyahu needed to solidify his base in the Knesset, sided with the most far extreme right parties who stoked the most extreme, the nastiest of Israeli extremists. And that started kind of violence against Arabs in East Jerusalem, Israeli Arabs in East Jerusalem, the evictions. So and that's really kind of, I think, what has sparked a lot of this kind of collective Palestinian outrage between that and the shootings in Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so I think that Gideon and Nirmal are so right that this right element is really dynamic. But I think it's also kind of fanning the flames there and making it's not sustainable. I agree with Nirmal that the countries want to kind of keep it low key. But when you see what's happening throughout Israel, throughout all these Arab towns, the kind of delicate fabric of coexistence, even in these mixed cities, is being destroyed. I don't see where you're not going to get that comprehensive peace deal. But I feel like the dam has really broken in the sense that you need to do something to change the status quo on the ground, at least.
Well, of course, there's the domestic Israeli part that plays into this with, you know, some of friends that I've talked about with in Israel on the left, admittedly looking at what Netanyahu was doing as sort of a deliberate attempt to undermine what looked like a coalition agreement that would have finally ousted him from power, with Naftali Bennett siding up together with the Arab Islamist Party, which holds the key to the future, and the centrist and left for a majority in the Knesset, and that when the violence exploded, that very tangential coalition fell apart, and we're likely to go to fifth elections. And what happens when you go to elections? The person in power remains in power, and that Bibi Netanyahu. It may work out well, at least for that point, up to that. We'll be back to this issue many, many times, because a ceasefire, which of course everyone wants, the kind of violence we've seen was truly horrific on all sides. 4,000 rockets landed on, or at least was shot at Israel. They didn't land on Israel, all of them, but they still killed over 12 Israelis, and of course hundreds of deaths in Gaza, including many women and children. A terrible situation that, at least for now, has ended, which is a good thing. Let me turn over Gideon to another conflict that gets none of the press attention than this one does, where it is equally worrisome and brutal in what is happening, and that's in Myanmar. In Burma, you had a fantastic podcast on this issue today. We haven't talked about it for a few weeks. Bring us up to date about what's happening in Myanmar and why we should care.
Yeah, well, as you say, I mean, there was a flurry of press attention when there was a military coup there on February the 1st. But it's gone out of the headlines, and you might think for that reason that, well, things have calmed down, but actually they haven't. There are civil unrest in the cities. There's fighting across the country, particularly in the border areas where there's always been unrest. There's been something like several hundred people killed. The best estimate I've seen is 800 killed in repression, but there's also fighting out in very obscure areas where there will doubtless have been other deaths. 5,000 people arrested, including Aung San Suu Kyi. Very repressive situation, but also the economy really in free fall. It had been very badly damaged by COVID. Now there have been general strikes, closures all over the place, and really no sign of any political solution. If anything, it's getting worse. The army it's a kind of stalemate. The army is in control, but it's not really in control of the country. And why should the rest of the world care? Well, I mean, I think, the fact that they're not, there isn't much international action suggests they don't, but it's in danger of becoming one of those classic failed states. And it's a big place. It's a population of close to 60 million people, borders China, borders India, borders Thailand. And just to give you an example, it's already a major center for the production of methamphetamine. Something like 70, I jotted down the figure because it was so extraordinary, but it's many, many billions of dollars worth of meth is already produced there. And, if the rest of the economy collapses and sort of central government collapses, that kind of anarchic narco state becomes much easier. Plus, of course, you will have flows of refugees and the potential for a great power struggle there as China and India kind of scratch their heads about, who is eventually going to assert control. So it's a kind of human rights catastrophe, an economics catastrophe, a governance catastrophe, and a potential great power flashpoint.
Well, other than that, it's things are going well. But Nirmal, it's also in the region, the impact is real, and it's clearly the case that in places like Singapore and Southeast Asia, throughout Southeast Asia, this is not being ignored, because the conflict is in some ways threatening to spill over in either in human misery with refugees or in its economic impact. ASEAN had a meeting with, it invited the Burmese leadership to be part of that, awkward as it was. Was that one way to see if they could find a way to stabilize the situation, or how do you think the major powers in ASEAN are trying to deal with the crisis?
Well, it was a good sign given that the general actually showed up. Myanmar actually came to the table and heard what everybody's concerns were in ASEAN. So at least that dialogue is still there. Of course, they went back and said, oh, they were just suggestions. So nothing much changed. And ASEAN has also started a humanitarian initiative. Now, what you said earlier, Ivo, it's very important that this stays on the front pages, because as Gideon, and I can't help but completely agree with everything Gideon said, it's descending into a into a collapsed state, into a failed state. The UNDP has warned that 26 million additional people will be in poverty next year. This is the conflict. It's had a civil war on and off for decades, but this civil war is now creeping outwards and is threatening to engulf the whole country. It's northern Myanmar is, as Gideon said, the sort of methamphetamine factory of the entire Asia Pacific, from Japan to New Zealand to Malaysia. It supplies meth, right? So the state will eventually be captured by transnational organized networks, criminal networks. The banks are not giving loans. Farmers can't get loans. ATMs are not even dispensing money. It's really heading very rapidly into a deep hole. And we have refugees already, thousands of refugees actually, probably undercounted, in India as well as in Thailand. So look, a little more humanitarian, we have to brace for a humanitarian catastrophe in Burma, an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. And one way to deal with it is to empower ASEAN to do something with its humanitarian initiative. If people were to, if the states or the UN agencies and so forth were to contribute to that initiative, that is one way to address what is going to be a long-running disaster, frankly.
Elise, at the outset of the crisis in February, the administration seemed to be seized by this, both because it violated its democracy agenda that you talked earlier about, and it posed a threat to the stability and focus of the Indo-Pacific strategy that it had to be focusing on China. And yet it seems like the last 4 or 6 weeks, the word Burma, which is how the U.S. still officially refers to Myanmar, hasn't crossed the lips of the administration spokespeople in any way, and it seems to have been forgotten. Is that because they're not paying attention, or because they're trying to figure out quietly to support other actors, including perhaps ASEAN, to deal with it? How do you see it? What do you hear? What's happening in the corridors of power in Washington on this?
I think it's a little bit of a combination of both. Clearly, yes, there was this Indo-Pacific strategy, but that was really in terms of countering China. Myanmar was a small part of that. As you said, they came in, had to deal with the crisis in the first few days. I think they felt like they were able, just like we were talking about in Gaza, there was a flare up, we're able to kind of, that will calm down. But as Gideon and Nirmal said, the kind of national security implications for the United States, I think, are very dangerous. And especially as you see the economy collapsing, the healthcare system is collapsing. I see a lot of parallels to what's going on in Syria when the regime is targeting, and Gideon, this podcast that Gideon had today, I really encourage everybody to listen to it if you're interested in learning more, because I follow it and learned a lot more. The healthcare system is collapsing. Doctors are on strike. And then the regime is targeting the healthcare system, just like in Syria. And when we talk about a failed state, when people can't get healthcare, they can't get TB medication, tuberculosis, they can't get COVID testing, they can't get COVID vaccination. That's a global health crisis that's exacerbating the pandemic. When you see what's going on with a failed state and you have weak government and there's a vacuum there, that's a national security crisis, because we see what happens. We're not talking a lot about what the regime has done to Rohingya Muslims, because we think about that as like a separate crisis sometimes. But there's that whole Muslim issue in terms of how are Muslims around the world going to see this area that's a failed state? Like that could be another national security crisis for the U.S. So I think the U.S. has to really pivot from crisis management on this situation to see this as a national security crisis that does fit in to their whole plans. And yes, part of a power competition. If you're interested in the Indo-Pacific strategy, this would be a good place to get involved and show some high-level attention.
Well, so far we'll see whether the administration is listening, Elise, because I think it isn't quite happening yet, but these issues do come on the agenda. And maybe one of the things that will refocus attention is what you mentioned, Elise, and let me turn to Nirmal and sort of shift focus slightly, which is the COVID crisis, which has this strange way of reappearing in places that either it hadn't appeared or is returning, even as Britain is opening up pubs and the United States is throwing away masks because we seem to be thinking that the pandemic is over. In East Asia, and particularly in Southeast Asia, as well, of course, as in India and South Asia itself, COVID is coming back at an extraordinary rate, destabilizing the situation, quite apart from what's happening in Burma. Nirmal, what's happening there, and how can this be fixed?
Very much a cautionary tale, unfortunately. Look, in Singapore, in just the last few days, we've had the cancellation of the Shangri-La Dialogue, the cancellation of the World Economic Forum. School kids have started home-based learning again, so it's a sort of what they call a circuit breaker without actually calling it a circuit breaker. Then over in Japan, we have a state of emergency. In Okinawa, we have high numbers, case numbers in Hokkaido, Osaka, several places. Thailand, we had the Songkran Summer Water Festival in mid-April, and there was a spike after that. The Indian variant was detected on the 10th of May. It's logging all-time high cases. 70% of the cases so far in this wave have been in prisons. So that's an interesting feature. And we've seen that elsewhere as well, a closed high-density environment. So Thailand is moving into a sort of semi-lockdown. Same thing in Malaysia. Same thing in India. Vietnam, which was the star performer and actually grew 2.9% economically last year, is now experiencing what is arguably its first wave, because the previous ones were just sort of blips. So what are the lessons? The common features are a premature assumption that you're winning, right? A premature declaration of victory or that you're doing well, and that immediately sort of people just tend to let their guards down. Then allowing large gatherings of people, which in some cases is inevitable because it's a cultural thing. So, and then you have blind spots. For example, I believe in Taiwan, they suspect that cargo planes brought the virus in. Everybody focuses on passengers, screening and whatnot, but there's cargo planes which could have brought the virus in. So you have all these factors. And then, of course, the big one is slow vaccination rates. There are either not enough vaccination doses available or distribution has been patchy. In most cases, it's both, because for various reasons, red tape, availability, cultural issues around vaccination, that is the big lesson. These countries have to step up vaccination. Thailand is behind, Vietnam is behind. They are now trying to step it up, but it's very tiny percentages of their populations are actually fully vaccinated. And of course, the other big lesson is a very fundamental one, which is that testing and tracing is absolutely critical. Because as we know, the virus spreads and is there before you know it is. So it's essential to catch it very, very early on in the process. So yeah, unfortunately, and India is of course a catastrophe. I think India is almost in a different category. It is such a huge scale disaster there. But yeah, the whole of Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, it's definitely a cautionary tale. We have to keep an eye on all these things. That makes me worry a little bit about the United States.
At least cautionary tale sounds right to me. And also this reality that really no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that raises this issue of vaccines and who is going to get it when. The Biden administration just announced that it was going to share 20 million vaccines. We have a global population of 7 billion people. The WHO thinks we need about 11 billion shots before the global population is sufficiently vaccinated. How are we going to get there?
Well, I mean, it's exactly as you said. Look, as of, I think last week, the US had produced about 330 doses, maybe 340 million doses of vaccine, and has exported about 3 million doses. Now, as a US leader, President Biden does need to ensure that all Americans that want to be vaccinated are vaccinated. But that's pretty close to happening. And it's, as Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, has said, it's time for the U.S. and other, countries that have enough vaccine to start helping those in those countries that don't have the money or don't have the vaccines, because it's going to, be able to curb the pandemic more. As you said, nobody is safe until everybody's safe. As Nirmal said, a lot of these people that are contracting COVID are, traveling through India. They're going into some of these quarantine places. The variants are catching up with them. And so the real way ahead of this is to increase vaccinations. And it's, China has shipped 252 million doses overseas. The Europeans have done 100 and some odd million doses. Russia, 27 million doses. So the US is far behind here. President Biden came into office and said he wanted to restore US global leadership and was going to do that in terms of COVID. And yes, it is generous to give 60 million doses, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. And we don't know what we don't know. And so these variants are, if they come into the United States for people that aren't vaccinated, it could spread, as Nirmal said, he's worried about the United States, spread like wildfire. And so again, the only way ahead of this is to help with the vaccine. And the US really should be, as it did with Ebola and other issues, be kind of, and other infectious diseases, be taking the lead here.
Gideon, the UK, of course, has more people with single shots, not quite the same as fully vaccinated, but single shots than any other advanced country, at least of size. Is there an active debate in the UK about thinking what it needs to do to ward off possibility of new variants overcoming these viruses by getting vaccines out? How is the debate there?
Not really. There should be. But I think that the UK is very concentrated on trying to stamp it out within Britain, very worried about the arrival of new variants particularly from India at the moment, which is already loose in the community. So there's a big debate about, is this going to prove to be something that gets around the vaccines, and gets us back to square one. And if this isn't it, might another variant come in, which does bring you to this question of, what are we going to do to help stamp things out? I mean, Britain, I think, initially was quite keen on crowing that how far ahead we were of the EU. Less keen to note that the EU, as Elise has pointed out, has actually been pretty good on exporting vaccines where the UK hasn't. I mean, I think we have contributed to COVAX, the international effort. And I hope that, as we get, and I think the US is probably in an analogous situation, to a point where there's something like most people are covered, unless we have this big setback from the Indian variant or the next variant, that will then be in a position to play a kind of leading role in global health prevention on the vaccines, which clearly, is the kind of foreign aid it should be easy to sell to people because it's so clearly in our self-interest. And Britain, I think, has been ramping up various production facilities. There's a new, I think it's the Novavax vaccine, there's a new factory coming on, and I'm sure similar stuff going on in other developed nations. So maybe in 6 months' time, we'll get to the point where we have more global supply. But I mean, the extent to which we're all interconnected, I think, is underlined by what happened with the Serum Institute in India, which was so important to the efforts for Africa, and indeed even for the UK. They produced a lot of AstraZeneca vaccine, and now they have to concentrate on India. So the whole global effort gets a setback. And as we all know, the longer this kind of rumbles on, the more likely we are to get variants that push us back. And just actually linking back to our previous discussion, and one of the reasons for concern about Myanmar is if you have a failed state in which COVID is running rampant, the borders are completely insecure, that is a kind of incubator of where COVID will keep rumbling away and getting out and escaping, developing new variants.
Exactly, and just on the Serum Institute, which you rightly said was going to provide so much of the vaccines that were going to go to much of the rest of the world. They've just announced they will not export anything until sometime in the new year. A real blow to that effort. Elise, we only have a few minutes left, but important trip by Secretary Blinken to the Arctic, to Iceland, Greenland, and for meetings on the Arctic Council. Including the first meeting between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Usually a big spectacle. I remember the last time that a Democratic administration came in, and was the first meeting with Lavrov and Hillary Clinton, and there was the big reset button, which unfortunately at the word in the reset word in Russian mistranslated, but that's for another time. How did this meeting go, and where's the Arctic as an issue for the United States?
I think the meeting was, as everyone says in diplomacy, candid but productive, but cordial. I don't know if it was necessarily productive. Obviously, tensions have been very high since President Biden came in and has been talking very tough about President Putin. Look, the Arctic Council is supposed to be a way to talk about climate change and sustainable development. But, this is like another area of great power competition for the US and Russia. And so Russia's been, bolstering its military presence in the north, turning its attention to the Arctic, working with China. A lot of concern by the US about that melting ice in the Arctic is not only a climate issue, but an economic opportunity. And so everyone's fighting for that. So then you get to the issue of the Nord Stream natural gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. The US has been threatening to sanction it. It did sanction some companies involved with it. It doesn't want it to go ahead. But I think one of the things that made this meeting a little bit lighter and less tense than it would have been is that the U.S. President Biden was reluctant to risk a transatlantic rift with Germany, and so did not sanction the head of the company, who is a Putin crony from the KGB, and is not going to sanction him. So not really taking that tough line on Nord Stream. That in turn, softened relations between the U.S. and Russia for this meeting. It's supposed to set the table for a summit between President Biden and President Putin. Doesn't look like there was much advance on that. So we'll have to watch this space. But I would also watch the Arctic space, because this is somewhere where the US and its major adversaries, China and Russia, are really fighting for influence.
I also fear, if I may jump in just for a second, I fear that the Arctic will become symbolic of our failure to deal with anthropogenic climate change. It's melting at twice or thrice the rate of any other place on the planet, heating. And while they all get together and talk about not militarizing and all that, they're pretty bent on doing all of the above. As Elise said, it's an economic opportunity. So I fear it's going to be symbolic of a failure in many respects to deal with global warming.
And of course, I think that's right. And as you fail with global warming and the ice cap melts, it also means that the Northern Passageway, allowing goods from China and Asia to get to Europe and the United States a hell of a lot quicker than trying to do
what they're looking
for. Suez Canal, which can be easily blocked as we see. So the opportunity, as a former mayor of Chicago used to say, never let a crisis go to waste. In this case, lots of people, including the Chinese, are already focusing on the economic opportunity that a melting Arctic provides. And I think underscoring what Elise and Nirmal said, a new area for geopolitical competition. We'll be back talking about all of this in another edition of World Review next week. In the meantime, I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh, Elise, Labott, and Gideon Rachman for an excellent, wonderful conversation here about a whole set of important and difficult issues, but we solved them all, at least for this weekend. I wish you all the best for the weekend. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next week, this was World Review.
Thank you.
Thanks.